My name is Cynthia Moore, and I was 34 years old when everything in my life shifted in a way I never saw coming. By then, I genuinely believed I understood who I was, the person in every relationship who fixed things, steadied the chaos, held the emotional balance without being asked. It wasn't some virtue I bragged about. It was simply how I survived life. For 2 years, I had been doing exactly that for my boyfriend, Daniel Rivera. And on the night things quietly fractured, I was doing something so ordinary, it almost feels absurd looking back, cooking dinner. The pasta water had just begun to boil, tiny bubbles forming like the prelude to an argument, while I stirred a pot of arrabbiata, Daniel's favorite. His phone buzzed on the coffee table for the third time in 10 minutes, the same sharp chime that had pierced the room all day, growing more intrusive with each repetition. Daniel was curled on the sofa with his feet tucked under him, his face lit by the bluish glow of his screen. His thumbs moved quickly, his brow furrowed in that familiar way he usually reserved for tracking market updates or trying to beat me in one of our useless trivia games. But there was something different about him tonight. The tension around him didn't feel like concentration. It felt like secrecy. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and tried to sound casual when I asked, "Everything okay?" He looked up with a delay, as if he had been pulled from somewhere far away, and said, "Yeah, it's just Marissa." The name cut through the room with immediate clarity. Marissa Hale, his ex-girlfriend. The one with the dramatic social media presence, the one he'd once described as a storm disguised as a person, the one he'd assured me was firmly in the past, and nothing I needed to worry about. I repeated the name and asked lightly, "What's going on?" Daniel sighed dramatically, a rehearsed kind of exhaustion, and said, "She's going through something. Her mom's in the hospital. She says she has no one else to talk to." A subtle warning bell began humming somewhere in my chest. I tried to keep my tone neutral and said, "That's rough, but doesn't she have other people she can reach out to?" He shrugged as if the logic itself were the problem. "You know how she is. She hates asking for help. Builds walls. That's Marissa." He paused, then added with just enough hesitation to unsettle me, "She called. She asked if she could pick me up for an hour to talk privately." The word privately didn't land softly. It sat between us like a closed door I hadn't agreed to. I stared at him and asked, "Pick you up? Why can't she talk on the phone?" His expression snapped from concern to irritation. "Oh, come on, Sin. Don't start with that look. There's nothing to worry about." I kept my voice steady. "I didn't give you a look. I asked why my boyfriend's ex needs to pick him up in person to talk." "That's a fair question." His posture stiffened. "God, why are you being like this?" "It's just a conversation. Her mom is sick. I can't ignore someone in need. That's who I am. I thought you loved that about me." The worst part was that I did love that about him, but I suddenly realized he was using that trait as a shield and a weapon. I told him calmly that I loved his compassion, but also valued our relationship and my peace of mind, and this felt like crossing a line. Daniel rolled his eyes in a way that made something cold settle inside me. "I need you to be secure enough to trust me. If you can't, then that's a you problem." That statement didn't spark a fight. Instead, it sparked a strange, still clarity. He wasn't choosing between me and Marissa. He was choosing between respecting my emotional boundaries and feeding his own desire to be the rescuer in someone else's story. Something inside me that had been stretched thin for a long time simply snapped in a quiet, definitive way. "Okay," I said, sounding calmer than I expected. He mistook the calm for surrender, leaned in to give me a quick, dismissive kiss on the cheek, and grabbed his jacket. "I'll be back in an hour. Don't let the sauce burn." The door closed behind him with a click that felt oddly final. For a long moment, the only sound in the apartment was the hiss of the pasta water boiling over. I turned off the burner, stood there in the heavy silence, and finally recognized what the tightness in my chest had been trying to tell me for months. I wasn't waiting for Daniel to come back. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't sad. I was done. I walked to the hall closet and pulled out my duffel bag and suitcase. I didn't cry or hesitate. I didn't analyze or argue with myself. I simply began gathering my clothes from the dresser, my toiletries from the bathroom, and my laptop and books from the living room. I set aside the sweater he'd bought me last Christmas without a second thought. When I reached the framed photo of us from our mountain trip, I didn't study it or reminisce. I placed it face down in the kitchen trash under the discarded pasta packaging. It took me less than 30 minutes to undo 2 years of building a life with him, not out of spite, but with the efficiency of someone removing a structure that had quietly become unsafe. I did a final walkthrough of the apartment not because I felt sentimental, but to ensure I wasn't leaving anything of myself behind. My key went on the counter next to the cooling pot of arrabbiata. I lifted my bags, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind that door I needed anymore. The hallway outside Daniel's apartment was colder than I expected, or maybe the chill was just the shock settling into my bones. I stood there for a moment with my bags at my feet, letting the sterile quiet of the corridor steady my breathing. Even then, I wasn't sure if I felt brave or foolish, liberated or numb. All I knew was that the decision I had made was irreversible, and for the first time in years, it wasn't accompanied by a tremor of doubt. It was simply done. I texted my closest friend Mike, the one person who had never asked me to shrink or stretch myself to fit around their needs. Out of everyone in my life, he was the one who knew how hard I'd fought to maintain the facade of calm stability in my relationship. I typed, "Daniel and I are over. Can I stay at your place for a while?" The dots on his end appeared almost instantly. Then his reply came, "Doors unlocked. Make yourself at home. Don't explain anything until you're ready." That was exactly the kind of friend Mike was, a refuge you didn't have to earn. The ride to his place was quiet. I kept waiting for some wave of emotion to crash over me. Sadness, anger, regret. But there was only stillness, the unsettling but undeniable sense that something inside me had finally stopped fighting. When I reached Mike's townhouse, he was sitting on the couch in sweatpants, a half-finished beer on the coffee table, and a concerned but gentle expression that didn't demand any answers. He stood long enough to pull me into a hug, the kind that didn't try to fix anything, but made room for you to breathe. "You don't have to say a word tonight," he told me. "Guest room's made. Towels are fresh. There's food in the fridge if you're hungry." He didn't push, didn't pry. He simply took the bag from my hand and walked it down the hall. I followed him to the spare bedroom, a plain, quiet space with white linens, soft lighting, and no history attached to it. The moment I stepped inside, I felt how different it was from Daniel's apartment. No shared memories, no lingering scent of arguments or half-resolved tension. The silence here wasn't oppressive, it was clean. After a shower and a change of clothes, I sat on the edge of the guest bed, letting the room settle around me. I didn't check my phone. I knew what would be waiting there: unanswered calls, unread messages, the beginning of Daniel's confusion. I wasn't ready to face any of it, and for once I allowed myself the luxury of not responding. I lay down, listening to the distant hum of city traffic outside the window, and drifted into a sleep that felt heavier and quieter than any I'd had in weeks. The next morning, sunlight filtered in through the blinds in crisp golden stripes. I woke with a moment of disorientation before everything clicked into place. Daniel, the pasta, the bag, the door. It didn't hit me with pain. It was simply a fact now, like waking up to a changed season. When I finally checked my phone, the notifications filled the entire screen. Daniel, 9:47 p.m. Where are you? All your stuff is gone. Daniel, 9:49 p.m. What is this? Some kind of stunt. Are you trying to scare me, Daniel? 10:02 p.m. This is ridiculous. Can you just come home so we can talk? The shift in tone was immediate. Shock, then irritation, then the first seeds of panic. I put the phone face down on the bed without responding and went to the kitchen where Mike was already sipping coffee. He handed me a mug without asking questions. After a long moment, he said quietly, "When you're ready to tell me what happened, I'm here." I nodded, and for the first time since leaving the apartment, a crack formed in the calm I'd been holding on to. I told him everything. The messages, the excuse about Marissa's mother, the request for a private meeting, the dismissal of my boundaries. As I spoke, I realized how absurd it sounded out loud, how clearly the situation revealed itself once removed from the haze of emotion. Mike listened without judgment, his expression growing more firm by the minute. When I finished, he said simply, "You made the right call." That afternoon, Daniel's calls escalated. By the third voicemail, his voice had taken on a sharp edge. "Cynthia, this isn't funny. You can't just disappear because you're jealous of my ex. Call me back. The accusation, the reframing, the implication that I had overreacted, none of it surprised me, but it no longer affected me the way it once would have. I realized with a mixture of sadness and relief that I had emotionally stepped out of the relationship long before I physically walked out of the apartment. By evening, after the fifth voicemail and a string of texts demanding explanations, I finally answered one call. I didn't speak at first. Daniel's voice came through the line, frantic and irritated. Cynthia, are you seriously ignoring me? What the hell is going on? It looks like you were robbed. This is completely immature. Can we please just talk about this like adults? When I did speak, my voice was steady. We don't need to talk, I said, and you don't need to worry. Then I ended the call and powered off the phone, letting the finality of that action settle into my chest, like a weight lifted, not added. The next few days unfolded in a strange, serene rhythm. I took a personal day from work, spending hours walking around the neighborhood or sitting in parks with a notebook I barely wrote in. I went for long runs until my lungs burned and the noise in my head quieted. I bought a set of new sheets, a small plant for the guest room window, and a new coffee mug, just because it felt symbolic to claim something small and entirely mine. It wasn't about replacing Daniel. It was about reclaiming myself. When I finally turned my phone back on, it was flooded with the predictable storm. Daniel's apologies, mixed with frustration, attempts to justify his decision. Manipulative half-admissions like, maybe it looked bad, but you know I'd never do anything to hurt you. And hollow promises that rang with the same tone I had heard too many times before. His messages came in waves: denial, anger, guilt, desperation, as if he were arguing with every version of himself except the one who had made the choice that drove me out the door. I didn't reply. I didn't argue. I didn't clarify. I simply let the silence answer for me. And in that silence, I felt something surprising and profound: peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from retreating, but from finally stepping into your own life without someone else's shadow stretching across it. For the first time in a long time, my days unfolded without urgency, without tension, without the constant anticipation of someone else's emotional weather. Mike went to work early, leaving me the quiet of his townhouse, and I found myself lingering in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring out the window at a world that somehow seemed wider than it had just a week ago. The silence didn't feel empty, it felt clean. But peace never stays unchallenged for long, and Daniel's unraveling arrived exactly as I expected, in chaotic, overlapping waves. When I turned my phone back on, after 2 full days of intentional distance, the screen lit up with dozens of notifications. The first messages were attempts at logic. Cynthia, let's be rational. Can you just come home so we can talk? This is unnecessary. The next were barbed accusations disguised as concern. You really blew this out of proportion. I'm allowed to have friends. You know that. Then the tone shifted again, softer, pleading. Look, I'm sorry if it came off wrong. I only went to help her. I'm trying to do the right thing here. Please call me. I scrolled through them, slowly, not out of sentiment, but with the detached curiosity of someone reading a stranger's diary. Each message confirmed what I already understood. Daniel wasn't actually grappling with what he had done. He was grappling with the consequences of losing control of the situation. His words weren't apologies, they were negotiations. The voicemails were a similar blend of bewilderment and manipulation. The first one began with him laughing nervously, insisting he didn't understand why I was being dramatic. The second cracked around the edges, frustration seeping in. The third one, left at nearly midnight, had that unmistakable mixture of blame and desperation. Cynthia, I told you nothing happened. Marissa just needed to talk. Why is that something I have to defend? You're blowing this way out of proportion. You were supposed to trust me. There it was again, the reframing, the moral superiority. What he meant was, you were supposed to prioritize my comfort over your boundaries. I deleted each voicemail after listening only partway through, not out of anger, but because the content was predictable and my energy no longer bent toward deciphering someone else's half-truths. Mike found me sitting on the couch that night, staring at the phone with an expression I didn't recognize on myself. He's losing it, huh? He asked. Handing me a bowl of pasta he'd thrown together, I nodded. He's spinning every direction at once. Confusion, guilt, defensiveness. It's like he's having a conversation with every version of himself except the honest one. Mike sat down next to me with a sigh. You don't owe him a performance. Let him spin. He'll tire himself out. He was right. And the next morning, the unraveling truly began. The first text came at 10:14 a.m. Marissa and I talked. It wasn't a big deal. I told her I have a girlfriend and she needs to respect that. I miss you. The attempt to recast himself as the noble boundary setter would have bothered me once, but now it only confirmed how much he wanted to shape the narrative in a way that made him blameless. By day 2, the messages shifted into confession without cost. Okay, fine. I get it. Maybe he's sorry she was being flirty, but I shut it down. I chose you. I came home to you. The irony was almost absurd. He had chosen to come home to an empty apartment, the absolute consequence of his own choices, and the phrasing made it sound like a grand gesture rather than the bare minimum of loyalty. I didn't reply. Then came the voicemail that revealed the truth he'd been skirting around. His voice was tight, breathless, tearful, the kind of tone someone uses when they've been emotionally jarred. Cynthia, please, I need you to call me. Marissa wasn't what I thought. She didn't actually need help. She just wanted attention. She just wanted me there so she could talk about her breakup. She didn't care about her mother. That was probably a lie. And after everything I said, after I tried to be there for her, she just ghosted me. She isn't answering my messages. I feel like an idiot. I'm so sorry. I made such a huge mistake. You were my person. I don't know what I was thinking. Please call me. I listened to the entire voicemail without flinching. Not because I didn't care, but because the caring had already been cauterized. His pain was real, but so was the fact that I was no longer the person responsible for treating it. I saved the message only as proof to myself that the story had finally completed its arc. By day 4, Daniel's unraveling spread to others. Another message appeared from a number I didn't recognize. Hey, Cynthia, it's Chloe, one of Marissa's friends. That surprised me until I realized the two of them had mutual circles, and Daniel had always been strangely eager to impress that entire friend group. I kept reading. Look, Daniel's a mess. He knows he screwed up. But you've made your point. Stop punishing him and just call him back. He says you walked out without warning. That's messed up. Don't be cruel. I almost laughed at the audacity. Cruel wasn't walking away from disrespect. Cruel would have been staying, pretending things could be repaired while resentment festered. I blocked the number without responding. Day 5 was quieter. Daniel's messages slowed, then steadied like a storm losing momentum. By the end of the week, the daily efforts to regain control of the narrative, to reframe, to seek absolution, to extract reassurance faded into sporadic attempts at politeness. Hope you're okay. Let me know if you want your mail forwarded. Can we talk when you're ready? I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I focused on rebuilding a rhythm in my life that didn't revolve around someone else's imbalance. I returned to work and immersed myself in projects I had sidelined. I went to a yoga class with Mike's girlfriend Lena, who didn't know me well, but treated me with a kindness I wasn't used to outside long-term friendships. In the evenings, I took slow walks through the neighborhood, enjoying the unfamiliar sensation of having thoughts that didn't orbit a relationship. And yet something interesting happened as Daniel's presence faded. I began noticing how much space he used to take up in my mind. The constant monitoring, the subtle anxieties, the need to stay one step ahead of potential conflict. With him gone, my internal landscape widened in ways I hadn't realized were possible. There was a sense of relief, yes, but underneath that was something deeper, the realization that perhaps the person I had been in that relationship wasn't the fullest version of myself. Maybe that version had been surviving. This version was starting to live. The final sign of Daniel's unraveling arrived exactly 1 month after I left. Not a text, not a call, an email. The subject line read, "I'm sorry." The message was long and constructed with the careful language of someone who had spent time in therapy, someone who had rehearsed their remorse until it felt polished enough to be received. He admitted fault, outlined his realizations about boundaries and insecurity, even acknowledged the selfishness of the private talk with Marissa. It was the kind of apology that would have shattered me a year earlier and made me run back. Now it simply felt irrelevant. I read the entire thing once. Then I closed the email, took a breath, and let the silence answer for me again. The month following Daniel's desperate email unfolded with a kind of quiet clarity I hadn't experienced in years. There were no arguments waiting for me after work. No anxious glances at a buzzing phone, no internal negotiations about whether my needs were too much. Instead, there was simply space to think, to breathe, to rediscover the parts of myself I had gradually muted over the course of my relationship. That silence, the one I'd once mistakenly associated with loneliness, had become a sanctuary. I stayed with Mike for another few weeks while I sorted out my next steps. He never once made me feel like a burden. In fact, he seemed relieved to see me settling into myself again. He'd come home from work and find me cooking, sketching, or researching new apartments on my laptop, and he always greeted me with that same supportive half smile. One night, as we ate takeout on the couch, he looked at me thoughtfully and asked, "When's the last time you felt this calm?" I didn't answer immediately. Calm wasn't a familiar state, not the way it should have been. "I don't know," I finally said. "Maybe before Daniel. Maybe long before that." Mike nodded. "Well, I think you deserve to live in this version of yourself more often." That stuck with me. I began applying for apartments the next morning. Within a month, I found a place on the 12th floor of a downtown high-rise, a bright, airy studio with a balcony that faced the skyline. The first time I walked into it, sunlight poured through the windows in a way that felt symbolic illumination, warmth, clarity. I signed the lease the same day. Mike helped me move in carrying boxes up the stairs, with mock complaints about his back while I set my kitchen things on pristine new countertops. When he left, I stood in the middle of the empty living room and took a single steady breath. The silence was different from the night I left Daniel. That silence had been about escape. This one was about arrival. Over the next several months, I rebuilt my life in a way that felt deliberate. Not reactive, not compensatory, deliberate. I bought art for the walls that I genuinely liked, not decor selected to match a partner's preference. I took weekend ceramics classes, something I'd always wanted to try, but never made time for. I started going to the gym with Mike twice a week, rediscovering the satisfaction of doing something purely for my own well-being. At work, I applied for a promotion that I had previously talked myself out of because I assumed Daniel wouldn't be comfortable with the increased travel. I got it. The new role came with a steep learning curve, but I threw myself into it completely. Somehow, the harder I worked, the more grounded I felt. Each accomplishment felt like a stone placed firmly into the foundation of the self I was rebuilding. My colleagues noticed the difference too. I began receiving remarks like, "You seem lighter," "You're more confident lately," or "Something's different in a good way." Each comment made me smile because I finally knew it was true. Somewhere around the 9th month, I met Lucas Bennett. He was a landscape architect collaborating with our company on a sustainability project. The first thing I noticed about him wasn't his looks, though. He was certainly handsome, but the way he listened during meetings. Focused, patient, present in a way that made me feel like my contributions mattered. Our first real conversation was about a set of proposed revisions, but somehow it shifted into a discussion about favorite hiking spots, then about architecture, then about food. It was easy, in a way I didn't trust at first. I wasn't used to ease. He asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I hesitated, the kind of hesitation that came from old wounds, not from lack of interest, but eventually I agreed. Our first date was a quiet afternoon walk by the river, followed by dinner at a little Italian place he claimed had the best pesto in the city. We talked for hours. It was the first time in a very long time that I didn't feel like I needed to manage someone's emotional temperature. Lucas wasn't a storm. He was a steady, warm breeze. We began seeing each other slowly, carefully. He never pushed for more than I was ready for. He also never made me feel guilty for the pace at which I unfolded myself. After years of walking on emotional eggshells, I didn't know how to accept that kind of patience. But Lucas simply let me be. That alone made me want to know him more. During this period, Daniel resurfaced again, not in a dramatic way, but through people loosely connected to my past. One afternoon, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was long and filled with a tone that tried to blend concern with subtle guilt. "This is Chloe. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I thought you should know Daniel has been having a hard time. He's been in therapy. He talks a lot about you, says he regrets how everything happened. He wishes he could apologize to you properly. Maybe it would help him heal if you talked to him even once." I stared at the message with a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. It wasn't my job to rescue Daniel's self-reflection. Not anymore. Certainly not after he had disregarded my boundaries until they shattered. The fact that someone else was now asking me to soothe him only reinforced how much I had carried in that relationship. My response was simple and final. Thank you for letting me know. I wish him well, but my position is unchanged. I blocked the number, placed my phone down, and turned back to the simmering pot of soup I had been stirring. The action felt symbolic, adding warmth to my own life rather than pouring it into someone else's crater. A few months later, the final echo of Daniel appeared. In a place I didn't expect, my professional inbox. He must have searched for it because it wasn't connected to any of my old accounts. The subject line read, "An apology." The email itself was long, thoughtful, written with the vocabulary of someone who had spent time in therapy. He admitted to crossing boundaries, to dismissing my feelings, to disguising his selfish impulses as empathy. He apologized sincerely, without excuses, without a request for reconciliation. It was the apology I had once wished for. Months earlier, it might have pulled me back into an emotional labyrinth. Now it simply felt like closure he needed. Not closure I needed to give. I sat with it for a moment, letting the words land without letting them linger. Then I closed the message without replying. Silence again was the most honest answer. By the 1-year mark, my life had transformed into something I hadn't realized I'd been craving. My job was fulfilling, my apartment felt like a sanctuary, and my relationship with Lucas was steady and warm in ways that felt both new and deeply comforting. One night, sitting on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching city lights flicker against the dark skyline, it struck me how far I'd come from the woman stirring pasta in a kitchen filled with doubts. This was peace, not the fragile kind that depends on someone else's choices, but the kind built deliberately, stone by stone, from the ground of your own self-respect. The invitation to Mike and Lena's wedding arrived in early spring, tucked inside a thick cream envelope with gold lettering. I knew before opening it that Daniel would almost certainly be there. Not because he and Mike were close, they never were, but because Lena still had distant friendships with people in Daniel's old social circle, and weddings have a way of pulling everyone back into the same orbit. The thought didn't shake me. It didn't even ripple me. It simply registered as a logistical factor, like checking the weather before planning an outfit. A year earlier, the idea of sharing a room with Daniel would have made my chest tighten. Now it barely grazed the surface of my peace. The ceremony was held at a vineyard about an hour outside the city. Rows of white chairs lined the lawn, overlooking rolling hills coated in early green. The sky was soft and bright, the sort of day that seems engineered for new beginnings. As a bridesmaid, Lena was radiant, and Mike's grin stretched so wide it looked like it might split his face. I stood among the guests offering congratulations, adjusting small details, doing my part for a friend's important day. Somewhere in the crowd I knew Daniel was present, but I didn't search for him. The horizon held my attention instead, wide open, uncomplicated. After the ceremony, guests filtered into the open-air pavilion where chandeliers hung from wooden rafters, casting warm light over the elegantly set tables. The air buzzed with chatter and music, the clinking of glasses, the laughter of people reunited after too much time apart. I found myself enjoying it genuinely, enjoying it, a reminder of how long it had been since social gatherings didn't carry a layer of emotional weight for me. Lucas joined me at the bar after finishing a conversation with Lena's parents. He wore a charcoal suit that matched the quiet steadiness of his demeanor. When he reached me, he slipped an arm around my waist, grounding me with his warm presence. "Everything all right?" he asked, handing me a glass of sparkling wine. "Perfectly," I said, and I meant it. The vineyard lights reflected in his eyes, warm and golden. We mingled for a while, speaking with old friends and new acquaintances. At one point, I found myself standing alone at the bar while Lucas talked with a cousin of Mike's. I felt someone approaching before I saw him, a strange instinct like the ghost of an old memory brushing past my shoulder. When I turned, I saw Daniel standing a few feet away. He looked diminished. There was something fragile about the way he held himself, as if every piece of confidence he used to wear, like armor, had eroded. His suit didn't fit him quite as sharply as it once had, and the strained smile on his face was nothing like the easy charm he used to wield so effortlessly. "Cynthia," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a year's worth of unsaid words. "You look good." "Thank you," I replied politely. My tone even and distant, not sharp, not cold, just neutral. The same tone you'd use with a former coworker you had no reason to resent, but no reason to miss. He glanced around awkwardly before returning his gaze to me. Can we talk? Just for a minute, please. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I shook my head gently. This isn't really the time or the place. His expression tightened with desperation. I emailed you months ago. Did you see it? I did, I said. He waited, clearly expecting something more: validation, forgiveness, a sign that his apology had softened something inside me. And, he asked, searching my face for an opening. And nothing, I replied calmly. I read it, that's all. Something in his face crumpled like a structure finally giving way under the weight of its own instability. He tried to recover, offering a weak laugh. I bared my soul to you, Cynthia, and all you have to say is I read it. Before I could respond, I felt a familiar warmth beside me. Lucas had returned his hand, finding mine with the gentle certainty of someone who didn't need to prove anything. He looked between us with polite curiosity, not a hint of insecurity in his expression. Everything all right? He asked, addressing me, not Daniel. Yes, I said, squeezing his hand lightly. Everything's fine. Daniel's eyes flicked to our intertwined hands. The impact was immediate, a visible jolt that traveled through him, shaking something loose. For a moment, I saw every hope he'd been harboring collapse. He wasn't angry, just undone. Lucas, this is Daniel, I said with composed politeness, an old friend of someone who used to be in my life. Nice to meet you, Lucas said warmly, offering a small nod. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hover with suspicion. He simply trusted me, and that in itself was a kind of emotional revolution. Daniel swallowed hard. So, you're together? Yes, I said, for a little while now. He looked at Lucas again, then at me, and I saw the final realization wash over him. I had moved on emotionally and completely. There was nothing left for him to negotiate, no thread, to pull, no unresolved wound to reopen. I wasn't the person he had left in that kitchen with a pot of boiling pasta. I wasn't the woman he had asked to wait while he tended to an ex's emotional theatrics. I wasn't even the woman he had tried to win back with late-night voicemails and therapy-shaped apologies. I was someone new. Daniel opened his mouth as if to say something more, but the words never formed. Instead, he gave a small defeated nod and stepped back. A moment later, he disappeared into the crowd. Lucas turned to me after he left. An old friend, he asked quietly. The one who told me I didn't need to worry, I replied. Lucas didn't press. He lifted my hand to his lips, kissed the back of it softly, and said, Then I'm glad you stopped. Later that night, under the glow of string lights and the swell of the band's slow melody, Lucas and I danced. He held me with a tenderness that didn't need to be explained, and I leaned into him with the ease of someone who had finally learned the difference between peace and compromise. As we moved across the floor, I glanced once toward the corner where Daniel had stood earlier. The space was empty now, truly empty. And I felt nothing, no anger, no nostalgia, not even triumph, just the quiet, steady presence of a life I had chosen for myself, a life I had